Chile with Sirius Dallas Moon, Mercury hour ascendant is applying to the Moon in Leo. Mercury is 21 degrees retrograde and Venus 23 degrees in Pisces. Midheaven ruled by Venus at 10 degrees Taurus and Mars 29 degrees Aquarius. So a couple of things prompted me to press record. So today, as I was doing my shopping for wartime, while they were taking down Ali Khamenei, and I will further address that in a bigger context. Um, I was thinking, because I was also looking at the events with NATO and the fact that the entire thing could prompt an Article 5 again since, I think, the war of 2001. And all the structural things that I, in many ways, predicted, they were showing in Mark Rutte's chart and NATO's chart, where the day and the night cycles can only be unified to preserve the structure when the war on the waters, which is something I'm going to elaborate on, is met from a different perspective. So that topic where it really struck me how people have to pay the 5% for all the times that they did not use the act of self-assertion in the face of the wealth of nations being derived from trafficking, extortion, looting, and money laundering. By the way, from Trump's chart, it's visibly seen that Saturn of NATO is on Trump's ascendant, where Trump embodies that Saturn and calls for withdrawal of United States troops during wartime, while meaning it when he talks about the 5%. But I want to zoom out a slight bit more before I talk about the war in the waters. And this is the purging of frustrations. And I think some of y'all have seen the evidence on my channel and so on and so forth. Is the purging of frustrations that can be very, how should I say that? Very robust, very raw, and very authentic to the frustration. And it's going to connect to the war on the waters. But this is also how these purges were coming right about when they unalived Khamenei. And they basically took the existential threat away from Israel. It is. Um, and so we also made it in interpersonal relation where there can be those boom crisis moments, but what is addressed during these crisis moments is beyond golden. And now I want to talk about what was addressed in this, which is the war on the waters. And the third thing that prompted me to press record, I really, really appreciate and admire Gracia Tassio's work from her perspective. And by the way, I do say that with tropical astrology or more modern astrology. I will just see it from different perspective. Um, that being said, it is amazing to have the enrichment of sidereal astrology and the ancient astrologies and their perspective, all denoting that we are in unprecedented times. So Atasio referred to the fact that Saturn was um, becoming invisible during the eclipse, and Mars, upon the attack of Iran, ingressed to sidereal Aquarius, which is Saturn's sign. Um, so it's the taking away of certain structures. From tropical perspective, I can see it through Saturn ruling over Pluto and Aquarius, and Mars with the eclipse point um, conjoining Neptune in the 1 degree orb, which was the attack began on the 1 degree orb with Neptune in degree 1, degree Aries, degree of war, and which is seventh house for Israel, but it's also um, very correlating to what Krasim mentioned, which is the war on the waters. I also, when I looked at the natal charts of leaders um, and the astrocartography of their Rahus, one thing was very evident for Vladimir Putin, and this is his connection with the oceans. And this is even spiritual connection, which is of course used in politics for the attunement. When one is one with the waters, of course they are called on in various ways. From I can speak NATO nation perspective because this is what I've been covering for the past year, and I can talk about also somewhat the atmosphere in Israel that is affecting what is military intelligence and so on. And this is that the spiritual disposition from which and this is what I addressed with my very raw song. Um, okay, and that rawness was about the spiritual disposition that is created by a training that I believe is ritual abuse. Not just because it's done to very young people and even infants, um, but because there are various um, philosophical, spiritual problems when we come to, let's say, wartime um, recruitment, both of funding and military recruitment. And this is the rituals consist of making people believe that everything is havalim, that everything means nothing. And this is also what Israel summoned for the war with Iran. During COVID, I saw that. I don't know why. And around 2007, I saw that. I think there was a mini war back then. And so, what happens with this type of atmosphere is a lowering of the frequency. And when we think about art of war, we actually want to raise the frequency to love and sovereignty frequency so we can have minimum effort, maximum sovereignty, and access the resources, whether natural resources or any type of resources, that we need to sustain our sense of self, sovereignty as individuals, tribes, families, nations, and empires. And of course, worldly alliances and so on and so forth. Um, this is my experience with the um, uncalled for frequencies of the Hevel Avalim, and I've had experienced that several times in my life. I did not find this. I found it lowering the frequency rather than operating on the frequency of love that is actually loving. Again, I don't say Christ and Antichrist. I don't say particular religion. I say the difference between collapsing the frequency to raising the frequency, the sense of self frequency. And that perhaps the waves that were met is that song that came about where literally my system um, deflected the frequencies of ritual abuse um, uh, that surround what we are now going to embark into, which is the war on the water. So people with um, people with Pluto in Virgo have the evolutionary astrology point in Pisces. And this is the time where we had the Romantic era, the historical, where people began to um, basically observe the sea. And for those of you who do not live around the Mediterranean, then you know more of what I'm talking about. When we talk about Northern Europe, the foaming monster, the gray foaming monster, that doesn't look like, the clarity of the Mediterranean beaches or the pale blue water, okay, the light blue water. This is a gray foaming monster aiming to get you. That one can get lost at any time. And I see people with Pluto Virgos. And the evolution to the Pisces, it's that which I'm talking about, because it's the depth of the waters. It's looking into the abyss very literally. This is also why the feminine was feared in those places, because that feminine was really something, if I'm half Dutch, and in Netherlands, we live underneath the ocean. Okay, we literally had to engineer our self-survival, combating the water, rather than seeing the water as a natural ebb and flow. But this is not the war on the water that we are embarking to. And this is where tropical astrology does come into play. Saturn, Neptune, and Neptune in Aries are opposing Libra. In Libra, we balance the scales. In our body, that's the kidneys. What do the kidneys bring? The water. It's a Venus sign. The clarity of the water is something that cannot be, if the clarity of the water is achieved, it cannot be sustained by abuse or appeasing. Also in our relationships, I'm Pisces ascendant, I have Libra 8th house, and this is where any form of appeasing distorts the clarity of the water. And any form of the clarity of the water brings everything that could prevent the clarity of the water to be purged, which would be also the next sign, Scorpio, the transformation of the water of the well. But the clarity of the water in Libra basically is what Aries is fighting for. Fresh water. And if this is an image of a victory, the water will be polluted, and Pluto embarking to Pisces will completely transform. If this is an authentic war on the water, which basically, what do we need to self-determine? What do we need to self-assert to bring the clarity of the water? It's not about overpowering another. Aries is a carnal sign. And in Israel, they call the attack the roaring of the lion. Again, all these lion imageries, Israel has Mars in Leo, Leo in the 11th house. So we saw people as lions, roaring of the lion. But at the end of the day, the West is going to have to, if the West want to make it in this war, and again, I can speak from whether it's NATO nation or the West, or Israel and the West, um, and it's true it's true to everyone, but I'm speaking from that perspective. And basically, they started the war over supposedly women's rights. They're going to have to provide wealth of nation based on child and sex trafficking and drug looting is not providing clear water. And it's on the wealth of nation. Forced sex and forced sex changes that confine people in identities, which is also what I refer to in that song, keep people culture cannot have in its linguistics a word for whore or prostitute if it wants to have clarity of the water, because those were people that were raped and tortured and trafficked. Okay, this is where I said my sovereignty is your sovereignty, your sovereignty is my sovereignty, and it pertains to the real estate, because a home, and Mars here is usually fighting for a home. We see it as real estate, we see it as natural resources, but they're supposed to sustain a sovereignty, and the sovereignty within the home, the sovereignty within the relation. All of those, havalim, redemption by torture and so on and so forth, collapsing the frequency, soul selling and so on and so forth, they don't take the war on the waters. They may get the control over the seas, but those seas are going to be radioactive and polluted. And it's true not only to the West. Again, I've been covering the NATO nation for a year and something, and Aries is also, by the time where we speak, well, our lineages, which would be the way that Israel used those rituals to collapse the frequency and those trafficking as wealth of its nation, which is upturning. It's not upturning against Israel, it's coming to be purified, because they have declared war on Iran because of the topic of women's rights, that was the excuse, and they're going to have to apply. They're going to have to appease the excuse that gave them the legitimacy to use resources to bomb Iran. And the fact that the existential threat was taken from Israel. In the past, we saw it as people no longer wanting to recruit to military, expecting housing, expecting rights, saying, hey, we won the war, we are supposed to live a good life. This is what we had in 67, and Saturn return to 67 in the coming 3 years. But the bigger war is the war on the waters, and this is 15 years of Neptune in Aries, tropical Aries, opposing Libra, basically fighting to purify the water. We cannot have military recruitment and we saw it in NATO, in the Allied nations, and we saw it in the caveat of those who did go to war in Israel and came back war criminals to the world, that those frequency collapses that are to do with Epstein occultism don't bring the water. And I want to address also the logos. The logos of those rituals is to make nothing mean anything, and they are desensitized to doing basically worst atrocities. But the logos of the war on the water and the clarity of the water is sense of self, sovereignty, true cohesion. My sovereignty is your sovereignty is my sovereignty, and the elimination, the gradual elimination of war by self-assertion, self-determination, and individual human rights in such a way that brings clarity of the water. It's a different logos, and this is the logos that can sustain. When I look at NATO alliance and I look at Saturn ruled by Mars, but Mars being the malefic out of sect, although in its home sign, I see that NATO to sustain has to unify the sects, which can only happen in zero slavery, zero rape, but it's also the individual, the sense of self, no forced sex or gender changes. And it cannot happen with the collapsed frequency of the havalim, or the nothing means anything, or redemption by torture. And do I see NATO continuing to exist if it does make these adjustments? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I stand to my conviction. Okay, a lot of people take, maybe one song or one expression and think that they have drama. No, they don't have drama. I stand to my conviction, and this is a part of my conviction. When people are elected to a certain role and they have Rahu Moon with that election, it's like a Rahu Moon synastry. There will be many that will try to separate, but it doesn't mean in itself anything other than what it means. The structural challenges of NATO are to do with the bigger issues, and anybody that would take a leadership role in NATO, whether the Allied nations, the Secretary General, the military elite command, would go into the 8th house sun, which means that they would be in the role of addressing what was not addressed. And in that case, it was the 5% and the structure and the issue of sovereignty of the Allied nations, also US, and the Allied nations with US. The issue of the collapsing of the frequency and the military training that is associated with Epstein cult, but not just Epstein. We also see it in Israel. We also see it in other places. This is preventing the unification of the sects, okay, which means that the night sect and day sect are separated, and this doesn't function to the best of the military allied nations. Talking about NATO. I have addressed this in various ways, in various forms, immediately as I covered NATO chart, and this does sustain when we shift the fundamental ground zero of every perspective, because from tropical perspective I can see it as Saturn Neptune. From other perspective, colleagues like Krasietas, you see it as Saturn going invisible in sidereal Pisces, conjoining Neptune during an eclipse. is simply unprecedented. It's so rare that Krasi had struggled to find a sidereal equivalent to the spirit of the times, which I, as a tropical astrologer, can very simply see Saturn ruling over Pluto, Saturn, Neptune, sextile in Sedna, Sedna in 0 degree Gemini. That in itself is the 12th millennia. The Saturn Neptune sextile in Sedna in Gemini, and Gemini, and the stories of Sedna, which I've been talking about since Spirit of Matter channel on YouTube. So, to those that were looking for drama in my songs, um, don't look no farther. I still stand to my convictions that I have been having since 2023, 2024. I still stand to the fact that NATO alliance is the only active alliance that have had Article 5 prompted and acted on it, and we might have another prompting of Article 5. And I still stand to my conviction that the issues of collapsing of the frequencies is both First Nations, allied nations, and global nations and alliances and organizations that needs to be addressed. Very simply put, human rights is not a recommendation. Slavery-based societies are creating economy bubbles. Wealth of nation that is money laundered from child and human trafficking and drug looting is an economy bubble, um, and and when the bubble is going to pop, people are always going to blame the current ruler, that where the problem hadn't originated there. Um, so yes, and we see that the more those even technologies that were founded in the context of not the context of clarity of the water, they don't bring a win in the war on the waters with clear water. And that's not something that people can compromise on. And I think that when it comes to housing, when it comes to work, when it comes to life, um, real estate. Okay, this is, by the way, today is a great election to besiege Epstein debt estates and release and daycare centers and release the people that are trafficked there. And it is just the time. And I will share with you a personal detail. Um, I have contacted Netherlands to try and see if they can assist whether my mother and I in case of emergency, because I saw the nations calling their civilians and citizens. And as usual, upon such correspondences, everything around housing, around work, around the many things that I've been tending to is comes crashing to the surface. And dealing with those topics is looking into the abyss on a consistent basis and reminding us that the sovereignty we seek is not by those things that cause those traumas. Um, and and like I said, I have already addressed the Detru case or the Rolodex case, and the way that those havalim training create Mark de Troyes. By the way, for people wondering about the roundhouse, it was connected to the juristic system. So that's the roundhouse, and it's juxtapositions of many, many cases. Okay, so people that were looking for something more personal than that, then no, that's not the case. Yes, I think that's pretty much what I have to say. Um, and it's something that definitely, if I take a look at the NATO chart, 8th house Aries was swiped under the rug, but now can no longer be swiped under the rug. And people are leaders are people that have Virgo ascendants, would also have Aries in the 8th house. Some of them dealing with Sadhis, um, and again, those things that were swiped under the rug. I have ascendant Pisces, so for me, Libra issues. By the way, the clarity of the water, okay, is basically me dealing with my 8th house swiped under the rug issues. Because the eureka that I had was, wait a second, in the house I had to escape from, I wasn't bringing the water. And not only that, there were issues literally with all those agendas that call people to pay for the water and so on and so forth. And issues of things that a house should not contain. Whether and they caused a lot of trauma. So for me, dealing with this issue for my 8th house that was swiped under the rug was, wait a second, if I'm watering a house, it means it's not a safe house for me. It's not a safe home for me. Um, and the people that have moons in Aries, they may deal with that from, is the strategy to defend sovereignty actually yields a sense of self. Um, and this is something we all deal with um, wherever that Aries is. For me, the ruler of my 7th and 4th is in Aries, so I also deal with that around house. That Rao of NATO is right where the ruler of my 7th and 4th is. So, and that Uranus return is going to be in my 4th. With Chiron approaching, this is true. Echt so. And I have natal Chiron Rao in the 4th house. So I'm aware that is basically completely transforming for the house to be a house where one can bring the water. We can't have it a Detro state. And not father of Melissa state either. Um, And that was the issue around basically being safe in our home. I've been tending to political assassination prevention. So the issue of being safe in our home um, has been a big issue. And the particular moons that I tended to had a conjoining the ruler of my fourth and seventh, which is housing. Um, um, this is the truth. This is the chart doesn't lie. And the understanding that for these figures to have safety in their homes, or safety, what I say is relevant, and for me what I say is relevant. And of course Aries is sovereignty. um, doesn't work with slavery notions, with any type of racism or sexism, classicism. I mean, classicism is good for classical music, but not more than that. um, and yes, it is. And in both Israel and Netherlands, this is is shaking the fundamentals, um, but also in the world. Um, 15 years of Neptune in Aries, and we already see this as a crisis, a financial crisis in the world, also when it comes to military um, alliances and so on. But it's also a global financial crisis in the world because it's a fundamentals of the world. Um, Rahu still in Pisces accentuates the looking into the abyss, looking into what were those rituals doing to the depth of the deep of our psyches and the waters of our psyches. And from there, okay, think about Pisces as the water of preconception. Children being in the water of preconception, absorbing those things can be tremendous trauma. But addressing those things while it's a tremendous tsunami, but this tsunami is to clear the water. Um, yeah. So I know. Yeah, that is so. Again, for people that were looking for big drama, I'm sorry to let you down. No big dramas in the sky other than a world war. But remember, those who have problem to pay the 5% should ask themselves, why ever did they come back home after the White March? What 1%? Why ever did they not besiege the Detru states, the roundhouse, the daycare centers? That's 2%. Why ever did they swipe the testimonies as satanic panic under the rug? That's 3%. Why ever did they fall into blue and red and right and left and this religion, that religion, courtesan, cartesian division, when they address the core issues and use them to um, as a card to manipulate, that's 4%. And however did they thought sex work is work, but they said the Me Too went too far. That's the 5%. And they can pay them in dividends. It's never too late to start the White March and sustain it, to besiege the daycare centers. If people don't want to go to war over what they don't believe will defend their sovereignty, let them actually take action. To strike against workplaces that make every work an informant and a trafficking place, let alone housing residents. Or not to bitch about the 5% and the mandatory army recruitment, to the very things that they have been voting, not just with their feet, but with their souls, depriving people of sovereignty for such chronicle periods that now when they asked um, and that's the 5%. So